Hello and welcome to Identerati Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue, and today is episode 75. The topic is Trinsic's pivot from SSI to identity acceptance. Our guest today is Riley Hughes, co-founder and CEO of Trinsic. Welcome, Riley.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here.
And you might have to pivot down to show your Christmas shirt. This is the last episode of this year, and Riley's in the spirit.
That's right. It's the Grinch
And
is a favorite Christmas movie in our household. So I'm sporting the Grinch sweater today.
I'm inspired. Next year, I'm gonna get my sweater out for the live stream for the last live stream of the year.
Yeah.
So Riley, before we dive into Trinsic's pivot or Trinsic's new model, why don't you just tell the audience a little bit about yourself? How did you end up in this industry, and where did you get started, and where have you been spending your time?
Sure. Yeah. So I I got into the identity industry in late 2017. I interviewed for a job with Phil Windley, who's the one of the co-founders of the Internet Identity Workshop, and he hired me as the first employee of the Sovereign Foundation, which at the time was sort of one of the early and I would say legitimate blockchain meets identity projects, right? So there's been lots of blockchain identity things, some of which are more legit than others. I would say Sovereign fell in the more legit camp, and at the time I didn't really know that. It could have totally been a scammy blockchain crypto whatever thing, and I wouldn't have known because I was just a
That
college
Phil guy
intern.
is pretty shady. So
I
Phil
know,
was a
yeah.
guest. He was one of our first guests on Identerati Office Hours. And yeah, so you couldn't have found a better person to basically, from a business or technical
Yeah,
level to work. Yeah, we love Phil. Yeah.
I totally agree. So I really feel like I lucked out, falling into this organization with amazing people that I learned so much from. Both on, I learned about how identity works technically from people like Phil and Drummond and others, and then got to learn about sort of the business side of all this stuff from other people in the space who I got to work with in that time. So I felt lucky to be in that position, good right place, right time sort of thing. And then in 2019, after being at Sovereign for about 2 years, felt like I had a perspective on the space and kind of a belief about what needed to exist that didn't. And so I started Trinsic with my two co-founders in 2019, and fast forward 2.5 years later, or 5.5 years later, excuse me, and here we are.
Okay. So the topic of this episode is about Trinsic's pivot. But before we get to the pivot, I'm curious, what was the original business model of Trinsic?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, I started at Sovereign, which was kind of a blockchain built for identity. The perspective that I developed while I was there is that a lot of people were interested in this thing, right? There were all these organizations joining the Sovereign Foundation Association or whatever, and there were all kinds of, there's a lot of interest in what we were doing at places like conferences and things like that. And so I thought, geez, there's so much interest, but there's nothing live. Like there's nothing real yet. So why is that? Well, my first hypothesis was because it was very hard to get started. You needed to go get open source code. You needed to run it locally in a Docker container. And by the way, that there's a million. It's not easy. It didn't always work. Just work out of the box like people maybe expected it should. And in order to make changes or to really build on it, you needed to interact with cryptographic libraries directly. And developing against it was hard. So we thought, let's just host this and put a REST API on top of it and make it just a very, very, very easy developer experience for somebody to build decentralized identity stuff, whatever they wanted to build, right? Like issue a verifiable credential, create a decentralized identity wallet, whatever you wanted to do with it, right? We would just make it so that it's one API call away. So we built the sort of first SaaS product, SaaS like infrastructure for decentralized identity that I'm aware of. I mean, maybe somebody else doing it at the same time or whatever else, but that was sort of the at the time the perspective we had, and that was the first product that we built.
Would you say, in hindsight, and I'm putting you on the spot as a business person and as I would say a really great founder. And by the way, my definition is good founders can run a company, but great founders can pivot a company. So, so we're putting you in the former category, but now I'd like to ask you that you're in that category if you made one of the mortal sins of startups, which is you didn't start from a customer need, you started from a technology solution. Do you think that that's true with like the original business model at Trinsic?
I don't think so. Although it like I sort of view a lot of the startup stuff as like an experiment, right? So we had a hypothesis, we ran an experiment to test that hypothesis, and we got an outcome, and then we learned from that outcome and pivoted to the next hypothesis, right? And at the time, the customer need was that there were a lot of developers, hundreds of developers, that were trying to do something in with decentralized identity. And so we thought, let's make it easier for them. And then we were getting 100 new signups a month right when we launched in 2019. Right, so there were a lot of developers who were very happy that our solution existed and were willing to pay us for it. I mean, they weren't paying like huge sums, right? We had a developer plan that was $99 a month, and it was like you just get like basically unlimited non-production development access to this sort of decentralized identity technology. And there were all kinds of developers that were like very happy that they could build their prototypes of whatever the thing was much faster. So we did solve that problem for those developers. But now the question you should be asking is, what problem were those developers solving for their users,
Yeah.
right? And I think that was the challenge.
And actually, picking up on the homework, there was a press release reference where you're quoted as saying that the practical utility for businesses was severely limited. What was it that you saw that businesses did need, and what challenges were they actually facing?
Yeah, I think that I think the quote that you're referring to is from our recent press release about the Identity Acceptance Network, right?
Right. Right.
And so maybe it is now a good time to sort of talk about the pivot and how we kind
Right.
of
So, okay, yeah, and I was getting there. I was going to sort of build up on before you actually came to this new solution, which is identity acceptance versus identity verification. You sort of went through this process probably where you said, we launched this product and developers were interested in it, but it wasn't really solving business problems. But along the way, it sounds like you were able to identify some real business problems that
yeah,
customers
yeah,
were having. So before we get into the solution,
got
I'm
it. Yeah.
wondering what are the business problems that people are trying, or businesses, we should say, were trying to
Yeah.
solve?
Yeah, well, like I say, there were hundreds of developers that were building with decentralized identity stuff, and the question is like, why, what did they think they were getting with this stuff? Um, I mean, the spoiler of that chapter of Trinsic, right, that 4-year long chapter of Trinsic, is that not enough of those developers were successful in what they were trying to do, right? So they build like an app that would help people get more streamlined, like mortgage application process or something, right? And that just didn't take off. And then another one was building something, an ID wallet for farmers to manage their credentials related to their farm, and that didn't take off. And then it's like sort of go down the list of all these different applications that didn't take off, and then maybe I think the question is like, what did they think they were getting from this technology? And is there another thing that kind of another solution to the problem besides the solution that we were offering? And I think the thing that attracts people to decentralized identity is that once you have a wallet with some stuff in it, you can use it to instantly get access to the thing, to some service, right? So if you're a farmer and you have all these credentials in your wallet, and now you need to get farmer's insurance or something, crop insurance, whatever, you can like sort of one tap share all the information that's relevant for that transaction, and it just goes over to the insurance company. They can validate it's all true, and then there's this just magical user experience that can exist once you have users with a bunch of credentials and you have a bunch of relying parties that are willing to accept those. And that magical experience is something that everybody's trying to get to. So that magical experience is what we're trying to deliver now with the new product, and we're doing it in a little different way. The solution and how it's sort of architected under the hood is maybe a little different, but that magical experience is truly what Phil Windley sold me on in 2017, and it's still the thing that I'm trying to make exist here in almost now 2025. So yeah, hope that helps.
Yeah. So you have a really great podcast, and I have to put a link to the podcast in the episode notes, and people should listen to it. I actually listen to it and appreciate it. I know how much work goes into those things, so thank you for doing that, Riley. One of the recent interviews you did on your podcast was with IDMe, and I have to say, I have a lot of respect for their focus on the RP as the one getting value in this whole value chain. Like, it's great for users, but users aren't paying anything. And so as a company who has to generate revenue, we have to follow the business value. And what I think IDMe has done is really identify that it's not the IDPs who are creating the credentials or the people who are using the credentials, but the businesses who are relying on the credentials who are getting most of the value. And their marketing is very tailored to those RPs. Would you say that, before you came up with a new product, that you also came up with an offering that was sort of focused on the RP as the one who is going to actually be buying services from Trinsic?
Yes. I mean, that is definitely the new product is definitely focused on delivering value for the RP. Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, and regarding IDMe, I totally agree with you, by the way. Like, I really appreciate that same thing about them. And they've been very focused on really making sure they're delivering value. And, I wrote a blog post a couple of months ago about why I think verifiable credentials have not gotten as widely adopted as I had hoped. And, some learnings from the process of being in that infrastructure provider layer, and what did we learn about the people who are trying to take verifiable credential products to market. And one of the things in that blog post was that there was a company that saw the SSI world, saw the verifiable credential world, and the founder thought, hey, that's a really good idea. And while all these people are working on standards and are, sitting in working groups and, building trust frameworks for ecosystems that don't exist yet or whatever, I'm just going to build the same thing, but just use a database, and our credentials are just going to be records in the database, and we'll build it in like a month and just focus on going to market to RPs and just onboarding as many RPs as we possibly can, and just be like relentless and maniacal about our acquisition of relying parties. And that company has now raised over $100 million, started in like 2020, after the verifiable credential data model was published and gone out there. Really got the idea from the standard space, but then decided to do a proprietary version and has been just really crushing it. And so very similar to IDMe's story,
and
where
not just raise money, but actually they make real money. So there are some of these companies.
Well, I don't know their financials. I mean, it's possible. It's possible that they may, I don't know their financials, so I don't know. It's possible that VCs are just funding them on adoption or usage metrics or something, but presumably they have real revenue. Yeah, I mean, like you've got to assume that. So, yeah.
And I've been surprised at the emergence of eKYC as a market. Like, okay, you knew that maybe when you applied for a passport or something, you're going to have to present your ID, your physical ID. But now that process has extended out to a wide array of like companies, like in your example, Airbnb. You're like, okay, well, you're staying in someone's house. We need to know who you are. But sort of the market of companies that actually needs to eKYC is bigger than I originally thought. Have you found that along the way? Is that something that surprised you too in the last couple of years?
Yeah, I think like I remember, when I was getting pitched on joining the Sovereign Foundation by Phil Windley or whatever, and doing my due diligence on the industry and looking up, and at the time there, it was companies like Jumio and Onfido and other sorts of these EKYC companies that were raising big rounds of funding, and these were like the darlings of the startup scene in the identity space at the time, and growing really fast. And I remember thinking, geez, like this is like the cutting edge of identity is like photograph a plastic card and take a selfie, and like that's really what identity is online. Like I don't photograph a handwritten note. I like send an email. Right? I don't like photograph a check. Like I have digital payment things, and yet we don't have any digital identity really. I mean, we just have photos of IDs that we upload to company servers in a bunch of different places around the web. Like when I was applying for an apartment, I can't even tell you how many places I had to do this with, right? Or when I bought a car online, I had to do this same eKYC process. When I opened a new bank account, I had to do it. For all different kinds of vendors we use at Trinsic, I have to do this for the KYB process. So I've probably uploaded my ID to 20 different companies or something in the last, I don't know, year and a half or whatever. So I totally agree. I mean, and it's really proliferated. I think the challenge right now that industry is facing is the fatigue, right? Like now when I have to do that again, I'm just like, oh my gosh, not again. You've got to be kidding me. I've already uploaded my ID 20 times in the last 2 years or something, and like here I go again. Got to photo the ID again. Better make sure that the lighting is perfect. Better make sure that I take off my hat or my glasses or whatever, and make I don't know. It's just there's all these reasons why it's a cumbersome process, and so that's really where we're focused now, and the new product, and maybe you're kind of going there, and happy to talk about that new product that we have.
Let's talk about the solution and what's the difference between identity verification and identity acceptance, and how does that help the RPs? Because we've established that the RPs are the ones who have the budget, who are paying, so what's the product, and why is that valuable to these RPs?
Yeah. So if we go back to the magical experience, the whole reason why people would use decentralized identity technologies and stuff is to get that, like, if you already have some credentials in your wallet and you can just share something out of your wallet and it like happens instantly, and the RP gets the verification instantly. They don't need to wait for manual review or something like that to like go through. And there's all these big, great benefits when that happens. The challenge is that there is no base of hundreds of millions of consumers with a wallet, right? I mean, that's the like elephant in the room. So like the magical experience doesn't exist, and it can't exist unless you get to that point. And you can't get to that point without having RPs and issuers that get value in the equation to, get them to start adopting this stuff, right? So the question is like, well, where do you start? And the answer is there's hundreds of little pockets of these identity wallets. Or sometimes they're proprietary, like the ones that we already talked about. Sometimes they are built with standards. Sometimes they're built for just a certain industry, like travel or like healthcare. Sometimes they're geographically focused, right? And there's hundreds of these little pockets of adoption. The problem is that if you are Airbnb or something like that, right?
Pocket rides.
Yeah, if you're Pocket Rides, to a made-up app, to a made-up ride-sharing app, right? Then, and you need to verify users. Like, you're not going to go integrate 100 different identity wallets into your stack, right? And so you're just going to basically either wait for one dominant standard to rule them all, wait for one dominant winner-take-all kind of identity system to integrate, whatever the case may be. Like, you're gonna like it's either that scenario where there's a winner-take-all situation that all the RPs can adopt, or they're just going to keep doing their standard process. And so what we have done is sort of a third option, which is we're an aggregator of all the identity wallets that we can get our hands on for a specific use case. We're focused on only one use case, which is the identity verification use case. So any identity wallet that has already done a strong identity proofing and identity verification at the sort of, conceptually think of it as like the IAL2 level of identity verification on a user, we do a bespoke integration into all those different sources of identity. And pretty soon, Onfido's 9 million identities and Yodi's 10 million identities and Clear's 20 million identities and the mobile driver's license is 5 million identities in the US, and the whatever, you add them all up, and pretty soon you have a number that actually can move the needle for somebody like a Pocket Rides or a Airbnb, right? So the product that we offer is an API that allows a business to check for a digital ID on a user before they ask the user to upload a physical ID for verification. If the user already has a digital ID where they've already been verified, then Pairbnb and Pocket Rides can accept that digital ID. And if the user doesn't have a digital ID, then no problem. They just fall back to their existing document-based identity verification flow. So hope that helps.
This might be before your time, but there was a company called Janrain. And when social login first came out, it was annoying because you'd have to one-off integrate with like Yahoo and Google and Facebook, and they all had slightly different APIs. This was before OpenID Connect. And anyway, and Janrain gave you one API, and it gave you an interface where you could then select your social login provider. So it sounds like, in a way, not to simplify, but your Janrain for verifiable, that's not the right word. Your Janrain for wallet-based credentials, or for other, what do you call these credentials? What's the right word?
Usually we call them reusable IDs or EIDs. Wallet-based credentials works too. Yeah.
Yeah. So
they're not always wallet-based is the thing, right? Sometimes they're
Anyway, is that right? Am I on the right track?
Yeah.
You remember Janrain?
No, that must have been before my time. Yeah, but yeah, there are analogous products in the market in other industries. So if you look at something like Plaid is essentially an aggregator of bank connections, and they offer an interface to allow, an RP essentially to connect to, for a given user. A given user might have any one of 100 banks, right? So Plaid aggregates those 100 bank connections and allows the app, which is the RP, to connect to this given user's bank account and get the data they need out of it. And so that's maybe conceptually a little bit of a good comparison to what we do at Trinsic.
Right. I just looked it up quickly. So Janrain was sold to Akamai, and now it's Akamai Consumer Identity. It's a Akamai CIM as a service. So they had a very good outcome, by the way. A great leadership team too.
Cool.
So no, I think this is a good idea. I agree with you that no one eKYC company is going to rule them all. That's just not going to happen, especially as we're seeing the UD wallets. So the EU is going to have their own wallet. We're going to have Apple wallets. We're going to have Google wallets, and we're definitely going to be in this siloed world. And you could say that the US and UK governments in particular are looking to the private sector to do this, and they don't want to get into the eKYC business. Australia also has a number of different, I think there's some government, there's some bank, there's a number of initiatives in Australia. So I agree with your contention that we're going to see diversity of eKYC services, and potentially even, different specializations of, like, maybe we'll have one just for doctors, or just that does a deeper dive into their professional certifications. I guess one question I had is, does Trinsic add, so by Trinsic making these relationships to the different eKYC identity providers, is there any vetting process that as an RP, I get value out of the curation and sort of vetting that Trinsic gives you? Or is there any type of level setting so I'm better able to understand the capabilities or of a certain eKYC IDP?
Yes. That's a good segue. So our product sort of does three things, really. Like, the first thing is what I already mentioned, which is aggregate many sources. So we support something like 17 different countries right now, or have coverage in 17 different countries. Right now there's about 30 identity methods or identity wallets, whatever, that are live in the product today, and we're adding them quickly. So that coverage will grow. That represents about 100 million end users that have one of these sort of IAL2 ID document verified identities. And then, so coverage is the first kind of bucket, or the first pillar. of like doing a product like this so that it works. The second one is what you mentioned, which is think of it as like filtering, right? As an RP, I have some requirements about my risk tolerance, about my maybe I'm a car rental company and I don't care if you created an identity with a passport because I'm going to rent you a car, so I need your driver's license, right? And maybe I actually, for regulatory reasons, need the image of the driver's license. So in that case, maybe an MDL doesn't actually work for me because an MDL doesn't contain a photo of the driver's license. Funny enough, right? But so maybe in that case, something like Clear, where you've gone through the TSA, kiosk and you've uploaded your physical driver's license to this Clear kiosk, maybe that works for me as a rental car company, but the mobile driver's license doesn't. And so essentially, we offer a bunch of configuration and filtering options so that a relying party can say, here's what I need, and then we filter the universe of reusable IDs down to the ones that meet the requirement. And that could be a regulatory requirement, it could be a compliance or risk requirement, it could be any one of those things. You can filter by only ones that are Cantera certified as IAL2, for example, right? I mean, there's a bunch of these filters. So that's the second thing. The third thing is think of it conceptually like sort, right? Like sorting the options. And so for a given user, we can tell you which IDs are most likely for that user to have. So think of it as first you need coverage, then you need filtering and sorting to narrow down the universe to like optimize the user experience maybe, so that users are sharing just the things that meet the requirements and that they're not shown a bunch of options that are irrelevant to them.
Great, interesting. So what about from a legal perspective? Because if I'm an RP and I use Trinsic, do I have a legal relationship with the company who's eKYC'd? Do you also sort of clear the legal too and the liability so that they don't have to make, because they're trusting this document that's coming from the eKYC company? It seems weird to me that they wouldn't have a relationship, some type of legal relationship directly with the eKYC vendor.
Yeah, I mean, theoretically they could, if they wanted to, have a direct relationship, but the way that our contracts are structured, is that they don't need to, right? We have a contractual relationship with each of these providers, which, by the way, is like much more of a complicated task than I would have expected when we sought out. I thought that this was going to be mostly a technology, like it was going to be hard to like technically integrate 30 different methods, but then dealing with the legal aspect of 30 different identity methods across a bunch of different geographies is like we just recently got a whole big legal document in Indonesian, right? So like.
Well, that makes sense because Trinsic.id is an Indonesian company, isn't it?
That's true. Yeah, the .id is an Indonesian TLD, right? So, but anyway, so we have direct contractual relationships with all the providers. We have one contract that is passed on to the relying party. From a liability perspective, I mean, this is always a question, but generally, I mean, all of our ID partners, I should say it this way: none of our ID partners take on liability for the outcome of what they're claiming, right? So, like, virtually every eKYC company, with very few exceptions, essentially what they say is, you hire us to give you information, and then you need to make the decision and take on the liability for that decision. And so, if you go contract any one of these eKYC vendors, you can configure, 10 different toggles, right? And how you configure those toggles is based on your risk preferences, and then the result you get on the other side is information that you've obtained via these toggles, and then you need to make a call on whether or not you're willing to accept the results and do business with that user. And so, I guess what I'm trying to say is, from a liability perspective, we provide, our job is to get you the data from the source. So we would be liable if like somehow we tampered with the data or something, or like didn't accurately give you the right data from the right provider or something like that. But in terms of the veracity of the data or the like trustworthiness of like the what you're getting from the other side, I mean, it's not something that we are liable for fraud on the RP side, nor is it something that generally our ID partners are ever going to be willing to take liability for, because ultimately it's the RP that makes that final decision. So hope that helps, but
Yeah,
That's
interesting.
that's the way the industry is structured today. And generally speaking, with our business, we try to minimize the variables in question from an RP.
Hmm.
So we, in terms of how do we price this product? How do we set up the liability model? How do we deploy this from like an integration perspective, and like what do the APIs look like? All these things we basically just try to take the industry standard. The only way we deviate from the industry standard is we say it's digital IDs instead of photos of physical IDs, right? Like that, like we try to isolate the decision to like that question. And if you want to accept digital IDs, then that's the only thing you need to decide on, essentially, right? To use Trinsic. I hope that makes sense. But
Yeah. And Scott David, the famous identity lawyer, he always talks about tools and rules, and how the rules are harder than the tools. And your comments sort of confirm that as par for the course. The rules are harder. But from a privacy perspective, the way that I understand reusable IDs is that you're not holding any PII. Is that right? Like Trinsic itself is a trust conduit, legal trust conduit, but these you're not holding any identity information. Is it even in process, or do you see it in stream, and you don't persist it, or is it a direct connection from the KYC to the RP and you don't even see it? What's the privacy sort of like
yeah,
design of your network?
yeah. Um, there's nuance and there's a lot of configuration options that would change this answer, but I'll give you the default answer. And then again, like an RP could toggle things or configure things differently if like based on certain scenarios. So generally speaking, there's not a direct connection between the identity supplier and the identity consumer, right? Or the IDP and the relying party. We are a conduit to make that happen, as you mentioned. And essentially, the way we and basically what we do is, for all these methods, this like wallet-based paradigm, when a user take the California MDL app for example, and I'll just kind of walk through how the data flows in that example. A user gets to Pocket Ride's app, and Pocket Ride says we need to verify your identity. The user sees a button that says you can either upload your government issued ID or click here if you want to use your California mobile driver's license app. So the user clicks the California MDL app, and it launches them into the California MDL app, where they consent. They see the data that they're about to share. They hit consent, and they're redirected back. Right. What we do is essentially when the user hits consent from the California DMV app, we encrypt the data goes from the California DMV app to Trinsic. And for a split second in memory, that data is able to be seen by Trinsic, but it is immediately encrypted using a key from the client side that the user generates. So not one that Trinsic sees, essentially, or has possession of. So for a split second in memory, while there's a direct connection between the client and the Trinsic server, there is, the data gets to Trinsic server and then is immediately encrypted by that user key, and then we pass on. And so what we hold is the encrypted data. The client side then returns back to the RP the key. So then when the RP needs to retrieve the data from Trinsic, they call our API and they include the key in the API request. And then again, for a split second in memory, we can decrypt the data to share it with the RP, but so that we're not holding end user data unencrypted, even though it would be encrypted at rest, but it's never sort of encrypted in a way where Trinsic could ever access it, or give access to law enforcement if we were subpoenaed or something like that.
Yeah.
Right, because of how this end-to-end encryption is set up for between the IDP, Trinsic, and the RP. So that might have been a little bit too in the weeds, but
No,
hopefully
it's
that.
very interesting. It was clear to me.
Yeah.
So let's pivot to the business side. Startups have momentum, and it's hard to shift that momentum. I think people think of startups as being very agile, but actually, I see startups as like a ship. Everyone is going in this direction. You're leading the ship, as
Yeah.
the founder CEO. co-founder CEO, and it's hard to shift all that momentum. What were some of the challenges you found in going to your leadership team and your engineering team and saying, look, this old direction we were doing is we need to fine tune this or pivot it? Like, what were some of the challenges there?
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much here we could talk about, right?
Yeah,
It's a good question. The, I think the challenge is that you always, like, we had 4 years of data points about decentralized identity stuff, and when we had this hypothesis about essentially this different approach, we had, I don't know, a week of data points on it, which is mostly in our heads, and we go talk to customers and stuff, and then you get sort of more data points, but they're anecdotal or something like that. Maybe you build a Figma prototype or something and take that to people, and you get a little higher fidelity feedback, and then you maybe build an actual prototype, take that to people, and you get a little more feedback. So the question is sort of, when does the conviction on the new direction outweigh the like historical and like inertia kind of, like what does it overpower the inertia associated with just the sort of status quo default path? And I would say it took us about, so when I realized we needed to pivot, it was July of 2023. That was when I made the realization that there are no more paths, there are no more experiments, there's nothing else that I can do with this company to make this work at the level that we wanted. Now, I will caveat that by saying that we are venture backed. We are a venture backed company. We started it to be that way. The goal was always to build a large, impactful product company. So we could have pivoted into more of a services based company, and we could have had a great business there. I mean, we really, I think, could have been just fine. We could have paid our salaries, and we could have kept on going. But that wasn't what the co-founders of the company nor the investors signed up for. So what we signed up for was really a rocket ship, and there was no way to turn this into a rocket ship. And I realized that in July of 2023. Hope that distinction makes sense, right? Because I don't want to discourage other people from doing decentralized identity things if they're paying their bills and putting food on their table and all that. But I'm just saying for our situation, I didn't see a path to make it happen.
Yeah, you have to grow. I mean, growth is everything. And if you weren't seeing the growth and you weren't seeing a path to get that growth, then you have to get onto a ship that is growing. Not
Yeah.
You can't stay on that the non-growing path to achieve your.
Yeah.
If you're building a tech product company, like you're saying, I think that's totally fair. Um,
Yeah. And so I guess
yeah,
just to kind of, we saw that in July 2023. We moved, my co-founder and I both moved to Utah in August of 2023 to work in person to figure out what are we going to pivot to. So it was like, we figured it out. I called him and I said, look, you need to move to Utah in a month. So we both did it. Found a place, moved here, started working out of this co-working office that I'm in now. And we hunkered down, and basically for the next 4 months or something, we were in experimentation mode and figure it out mode. We got to the hypothesis for what we're doing today related to essentially focus on one use case, which is identity verification, document verification specifically. And people have already, instead of trying to focus on only building our own network and our own reusable IDs, like tapping into other reusable ID networks that are already out there, that hypothesis crystallized in maybe December of 2023. And then we didn't actually have a product or launch this current direction until May of 2024. So, and it was in May when we launched it that we pulled the old product off of the market. So we knew that it wasn't going to work in July of 2023,
I
and
just want
again,
to say
work
that
for us.
6 months ago.
Yeah, I know,
Yeah.
I know. And then, but it took us from basically August, maybe July, August to May to fully pull the old product off the market and have our new product be the only offering that we are selling. So I don't know if that, maybe that timeline. And then of course there's you asked about like going to the leadership team, going to the engineers, going to our board, going to all these things. And there was a process through that period of time where I think my conviction was pretty high early in 2024, and we needed to like launch the real product, so we actually had something to sell before we pulled the old one off the market, and that we did that in May. So yeah, I hope that helps. I mean, it was just a process of getting more data points over time and becoming increasingly more convicted in this new direction relative to the old one, that ultimately resulted in the full-on pivot, and then really finalized the pivot last week when we announced we actually divested the old platform to its largest customer. We sold off basically the assets and the IP related to that old platform. So we're no longer maintaining it, or it's not even part of our company. It's now part of this other company called Density.
That's also really hard to do. I always say, like, one of the bad things about startups is it's easier to start them than to shut them down.
Yeah, yeah.
But let's not get distracted on that. I wanted to ask you, so one of the keys for being able to scale a high growth business is having a unique selling proposition. Do you think that this approach that you have is unique? I mean, I'm not an expert in the field. I didn't see anything else like it. But do you think that this aggregation of existing IDPs, is that a unique solution in the market?
Yeah, short answer is yes. I mean, I wouldn't say that we are the only person who has ever had the idea of doing anything like this or something. And so there are other products that have a similar shape, or and if you look at the EU for the EIDAS 1.0 kind of identity wallets, there are aggregation services or EID hubs that support primarily the digital signatures and document signing use case. So there's some precedent there. There's a very large identity verification company called Signicat that has built a very big business being an aggregator of these EIDs, and for a long time they've been really the only game in town for that. And I think generally, again, it's like e-signature is a very big category there, and I think our hypothesis and approach is relatively unique, where we are only doing this. We're not like an orchestrator of the whole life cycle. We're a point solution that trying to be the best in the world at one thing, and that's it. We're only focused on one use case, which is document verification, and we support private sector reusable IDs and decentralized ID wallets and other forms of where these IDs exist, in addition to just government issued IDs. And so there's a handful of things that are unique, but the kind of depends on how far you want to zoom out or zoom in, right? But I think those are some elements that make us unique. And then I guess the other thing is that it's able to be fully white labeled. So we've built it in a way where all these methods can be called via API. You can orchestrate them all yourself and use us for the integrations, the legal and the technical kind of glue to make that happen. No pun intended there. Yeah, and versus a lot of other products which are they have their own UI or they have their own orchestration workflow builder kind of tool and stuff like that, which is great. I think those companies will be successful, but it's a little different than how we're approaching it.
Okay, so I have one more question, and then we're going to go to last thoughts. And in last thoughts, you can just say whatever you want. But my last question is just a quick one. Looking back in this, what would you tell yourself in 2019 when you first started Pivot to help you maybe have avoided? It's always better to not have to do the pivot to get it right the first time. What would you tell yourself now, knowing what you know now, to help you navigate that better?
Yeah, I think what I would say is that the market is reality, and your job as a startup founder is to discover reality as clearly as you possibly can, as fast as you possibly can. And the way to discover it is to build a model, right? So if reality is like a puzzle piece or something, your job is to build a model of like the shape of puzzle piece that you think will fit reality. And that if it's a fit, you call it product market fit, right? And if the market does not accept your model of the world, right, which is your product, then it's because that fit isn't there, and it's because your model of the world is wrong. It's not because the world doesn't see your vision about, it's not because everybody else is dumb for not wanting to buy your product. It's because you've hypothesized about how the world is, And if the world is not accepting it, it's because your hypothesis is wrong, right? I mean, the market is reality here, not you. So what I would tell myself is like, use that mental model, be explicit about what you think the world looks like, be explicit about how you want to test whether that is true or not, and build those assumptions into the product and do it quickly so that you can get the product to the market as fast as possible and see whether it is taken up. And if it's not, then go back to those assumptions and say, which ones of these is wrong, what have we learned, and kind of cross that out and scope out the next hypothesis and experiment, and then just do that again quickly, and do it much more quickly, and be much more firm on the sort of the market is reality, not you point.
It sounds like you've aligned with a very YC version of the world. There's a great
I don't know, actually. I'm not a big believer in like the lean startup model necessarily. I mean, I guess that I think there's a middle ground here, but I do think that anchoring on, I think the thing that the lean startup model or the YC model or whatever gets right is that the market is reality. I don't necessarily believe like fully subscribe to like all the other things that they build on top of that foundational point, but I think that foundational point is true. The other thing I'll mention is that the market can change, right? The market is not a static reality. It is an evolving reality, and that makes this game even harder. But anyway,
Right.
That's the last thing I'll say.
And we found that out at Glue because when we started, Identity Federation was in a very different place than it is now.
Yeah.
I'll just say one other anecdotal piece. I have a friend who says, he's like, the 5 most dangerous words in the English language are "wouldn't it be great if,"
Yeah.
the most dangerous for startup founders. And he's like, those words are only cool if spoken by a customer. And so it seems like a lot of startups, there's a disconnect between what they think would be cool and what customers think would be cool. And it sounds like what you're saying is what customers think is cool is like that basically is the product market fit. That's reality versus your model of reality. So last thoughts here. You can talk about anything you want. Action items. What should we know about Trinsic? How do we find out more about it? Any last thoughts?
Sure. Well, I guess what I would say is, Mike, you called it EKYC, right? So to the extent that there's, you're a part of an organization or you've been involved in or have any kind of a site toward EKYC where you're verifying users by an uploaded photo of a physical ID card and a selfie to do a biometric match, right? If you're doing that, then it's a no-brainer to check to see whether the user already has a digital ID, if they've already done that before. And if they do, they can get through that flow faster, right? They don't need to take the full minute and a half to go through that process. So it is working well, I will say, and it feels like it's a bit of a no-brainer to do that check. And it's, like I say, working pretty well. So if you're in that boat, we should talk, and I can show you how to make that happen. The other thing I would say is I like to talk about this stuff and share my learnings, and I get a lot of value out of being collaborative with others in the space, and I get a lot smarter by throwing my thoughts out into the world and then having people tell me I'm wrong, and all of that. So I would, if this was an interesting conversation, follow me on whatever social media you want, or shoot me an email or whatever. I like to meet people and talk about these ideas, and if anything here resonated with you, happy to connect. And my email is just my name @trinsic.id, and you can go to trinsic.id if you're interested in identity acceptance or digital IDs, mobile driver's licenses, EIDs, anything related to that. Our website's a good place to start.
Cool. So I just want to remind the audience that we're trying to get to 1,000 followers on Identity Office Hours LinkedIn. We get special magical privileges on LinkedIn when we do that. So please go to LinkedIn and hit follow. That could be a good Christmas present for the live stream community. We're about to. This is the last episode of the year. So happy New Year's, happy holidays, audience. And I'm about to announce 10 more episodes that'll take us through January and February. If anyone wants to co-host, send me a note on LinkedIn. I have 1 or 2 co-host slots out. Apologies for the delay. We've been sort of pushing this off until December, which seemed like I'd have a ton of free time. that hasn't happened. But we are going to do another 100 episodes next year, 2 a week for 50 weeks. So looking forward to it. Thank you, Riley, for so much for joining us. This is super fun. I'm glad that we were able to make this happen in 2024.
Yeah, I am as well. Appreciate your flexibility too. For the listeners, we had this scheduled for a long time, but then my wife had a baby right before we were going to do it, and so Mike was very accommodating there with all of that. So glad that we could make this happen, and this is a great production that you've got here, Mike. So thanks for having me.
And an even better Christmas present for your family. So congratulations. But yeah,